I am very pleased to introduce our keynote evening speaker, Bruce Bartlett, and he is in a way a man who needs no introduction, but I would like to give an introduction that is not written anywhere about why he represents so well this moment in American history and why he is here today. And that is that Mr. Bartlett started his career in politics working with Ron Paul and Jack Kemp and went on to work in both the Reagan administration and the George H.W. Bush administration, but really became symbolic of America when he, in 2006, published the New York Times bestseller Imposter: How George W. Bush Bankrupted America and Betrayed the Reagan Legacy. And since then, he became a critic of the Republican administrations from the other side. He'd been in them, now he was outside them. So he's looked at both sides, and he has quite a following because of that. He is the only real outsider commenting on politics nowadays. And he's also crossed a bridge in another very important way, and that is that he turned to social media, primarily Twitter and Facebook, to talk about politics. And what he is still apparently not aware of is he has an extraordinary following among younger Americans who are re-engaged in the political process, in part because they have an older mentor who speaks their language, listens to them, circulates their information, and follows what he has to say. So he's been on both sides of Republican administrations and on both sides of the demographic split in American history, in American society right now, which makes him perfect to end today with his observations about where the American political system is, and I'm very pleased to introduce Bruce Bartlett.
Thank you, Heather. As I've been sitting here listening all day, I keep hearing, ticking off the points that I planned on making that Alan Abramowitz and Paul Pearson already covered, and I was trying to think of how I can talk about what I think is kind of an undercurrent of this conference, which is that we have a serious pathology in the body politic, and it's the Republican Party. About a year ago, more than a year ago, I wrote a half tongue-in-cheek article in Politico about how I thought Donald Trump was a godsend because he would literally destroy the Republican Party. And since then, I've come to think that it might actually happen. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about my own journey that Heather alluded to, not because I'm narcissistic, but because I've lived through so much of this history, and I thought it might help personalize some of the more political science-y commentary that we've heard today, and kind of I'll see it from the ground up, so to speak. As Heather mentioned, my first job in politics was working for Ron Paul, who is still alive and kicking, and very much an important part of American, or at least one little wing of American politics. And after he was defeated, I got a job working for Jack Kemp, where he put me to work on tax policy, and one of my jobs was to draft a bill called the Kemp-Roth tax bill that Ronald Reagan endorsed in 1980 and enacted into law in 1981. But today I'm now pretty much on the opposite side of the idea of tax cutting. I had a piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago explaining that Trump's plan bears no resemblance to anything that Ronald Reagan supported, largely because circumstances have changed. And one of the reasons that I came to break with the Republican Party is because they just have this kind of cookie-cutter attitude that, something worked once, so let's just keep doing it again and again and again and again, regardless of the circumstances. And you see this, as clearly with Trump's tax plan, where he just keeps mouthing, slogans and making assertions with no actual analysis or any evidence whatsoever that he understands the tax code at all. And his accountant has said, no, he doesn't understand the tax code. I did all that stuff. But anyway, so I worked on Capitol Hill for many years, and what was interesting is it was the very end of the Southern Democrat era, and I think that period in which the Southern Democrats became Republicans is important and misunderstood. So I thought I'd spend a minute or two on that. Everybody talks about the Southern strategy, and they make it seem as if Richard Nixon was this evil genius who, used quasi-racist code and all that to get the racist Southern Democrats to come over to the Republican Party. I don't think that's really it at all. Because keep in mind, in 1968, George Wallace was running. He had all those votes. Nixon was running a very conventional Republican. Essentially, he was reaching out for the black vote that he remembered that Dwight Eisenhower had gotten. He got a third of the black vote in 1956. Nixon reached out for black votes in 1960 and made a foolish mistake when it came time to dealing with Martin Luther King that hurt him. But he was not at all personally racist, and the Republican Party had been the party of civil rights in many ways, precisely because the Southern Democrats were the party of opposed to all of that. And when Nixon became president, or when he appointed Spiro Agnew to be vice president, everybody forgets that he had been a very liberal governor of Maryland, and he got his reputation for being a liberal precisely because he was pushing open housing laws and things of that sort. He had an excellent record on civil rights, and this was the reason Nixon put him onto the ticket. And unfortunately, Nixon got involved in a lot of controversies about integrating the schools that really had more to do with the speed at which schools would be integrated rather than that they should be integrated. And Nixon was quite adamant that the Supreme Court and other court cases requiring integration needed to be carried forward. And some of you here may remember a guy named Leon Panetta, who was a deputy assistant secretary that the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and was in charge of education policy. And he was very angry he was a Republican in those days, and he was very angry with Nixon because he wasn't moving fast enough. And he resigned, this was a big stink back in whenever it was, 1970. But I mention this because a few years ago I ran into Mr. Panetta, who, as we all remember, has had numerous positions in the Obama administration elsewhere. And it was actually at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, who was up here on the program here. And I asked him about Nixon, and he said, with the benefit of hindsight, he was actually pretty darn good on civil rights. And I thought, coming from somebody who quit the administration over that issue, that was quite an admission. Now, where I think the really critical event in recent historical history was the 1974 election, because although it's widely repeated that Lyndon Johnson said something to the effect that when he signed the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, I forget which, he said, we've lost the South forever, or something to that effect. But the Southern Democrats, they were still pretty key part of the Democratic coalition, the Democratic Party, until 1974, and that was the Watergate year, okay? And all of these northern liberals came in, and they had such a large majority that they basically said, we don't need these antediluvian, jackasses in our party anymore, and they actively tried to push them out of the party, you see? And the main way they did this was by getting rid of seniority, because during the post-war period, the Southern Democrats had gained, an enormous amount of power in Congress simply through seniority, because they tended to get reelected very easily in their districts. And whenever the Republicans would have a bit of a sweep, as they did in 1952, it mostly came at the expense of Northern liberals. So the Southerners kept growing and growing in seniority to where they controlled many of the most powerful committees in Congress, and they use these committees to shovel public works and other benefits to their poor, impoverished region, which is still the poorest region of our country. And so they figured this is okay. I mean, we don't like all this civil rights stuff, but we still get enormous benefits from being part of the congressionally governing party. And so the Southern Democrats were satisfied until 1974, when the Watergate babies decided, okay, we're going to kick all these old Southern Democrats out of their positions. So guys like Bob Pogue lost the chairmanship of the Ag Committee, and Ed Abear lost the chairmanship of the Armed Services Committee, and Wilbur Mills lost the chairman of Ways and Means, and things of this sort, that they basically kind of broke the deal. The deal was Southern Democrats would vote to organize the Congress, and then they'd do whatever the hell they wanted to after that. And this was okay for everybody for a long time until then. And at that point, Southern Democrats became highly receptive to end treaties from the Republicans. And the most important Republican, I think, of the last 40 years is Newt Gingrich, who was elected in 1978 and was a historian. I say was. I don't think he is anymore. But anyway, he came to Congress from, I believe, Macon, Georgia, was where his congressional district was located. And he had a very interesting and different attitude. See, when I was working in Congress in that era, Republicans tended to view the Southern Democrats as essentially us. We palled around together. We co-sponsored each other's legislation, and so you had a lot. It was very easy to do things on a bipartisan basis because you could always find conservative Southern Democrats. And in fact, I think the most conservative member of the House in that era was a guy named Larry McDonald, who was a member of the John Birch Society, but he was a Democrat who I believe actually had Gingrich's district before that. And I know in the Senate when I was working there, the most conservative senator was William B. Allen from, I believe, Alabama, by far the most conservative. There were lots of moderate and liberal Republicans like Jacob Javits from New York. And so there was not this ideological division between the parties that has come about since then, and Gingrich is the reason why. See, Gingrich came into Congress, I believe he was elected in 1978, and instead of viewing these conservative Southern Democrats as allies, he said, no, they are our enemies. That is, we as Republicans should view them as our mortal enemies because they are holding precisely the seats that we Republicans could win if we would simply make an effort. And it was quite common up until that period for Southern Democrats to run absolutely unopposed, because the tradition in the South had been that all of the fights were in the primaries. And once you got the nomination, that was it, because there was no Republican Party to speak of. And what Gingrich figured is that a lot of these guys were actually kind of lazy. And they were, because they didn't really have to work very hard to get reelected. And so he started recruiting good candidates to run against these people and give them a run for their money and force them to get out and do work to raise money and politic around in their districts. And many of them said, hey, this isn't worth it. This job is not so great. I'm just going to retire. And a lot of them did. And once you had an open seat, the Republican candidates in many cases won. And as they did more and more of this, more pressure was put on conservative Democrats to switch parties, and many of them did. And so he really kind of got the ball rolling. It's just that it took, another, 20-some years before the process was complete. And by 1994 it was. Now, I worked for Ronald Reagan in the White House, and in that era of republicanism, I was quite happy working because I thought the Republican Party essentially was the party of ideas in that time period, and they did care about research and analysis and evidence and things of that sort, and they weren't so ideological. I mean, a good example of this is the fact. Okay, everybody knows that Ronald Reagan passed, one of the largest tax cuts in American history in 1981. I think very few people know that he signed into law 11 major tax increases after that. And by 1988, the tax increases that he had signed into law took back literally 50% of the 1981 tax cut. Now, still, there was a net tax cut, admittedly, but the idea, today, no Republican would vote for any tax increase, no matter how small, because my friend Grover Norquist, who I've known since 1974, would make sure that they would be defeated. And there's an organization called the Club for Growth that will basically does whatever Grover tells them to do. And if he says primary this guy, they say, we'll find somebody, we'll make sure he's got plenty of money, and we'll make sure that this rhino is defeated, and so that we keep our rigid control over no tax increases at any time for any reason. Now, just as an interesting anecdote, when I was dealing with Grover back in circa 1980, his base of operations was something called the College Republicans, which was an official arm of the Republican National Committee, had offices in the RNC headquarters, and Grover was the chairman of this organization. And his two assistants were Ralph Reed and Jack Abramoff. And one day he made a very revealing comment to me, because Grover is very Leninist in his operational view of the world. And he told me that Ralph Reed was his Trotsky and Jack Abramoff was his Stalin. And of course that meant he was Lenin. And I just thought that was very interesting because, Ralph is still around, and of course everybody remembers what happened with Jack. But that's just an aside. But anyway, I first started noticing a problem with the Republican Party during the George H.W. Bush administration, where I was working at the Treasury Department. And we all remember now his great apostasy in 1990 of endorsing a tax increase, a rather modest one. And I think it was an act of great courage, because I think he was looking ahead to the first Gulf War, and I think he had this old-fashioned idea that we needed to pay for wars. We shouldn't just put them on, or at least not entirely, on the national credit card. And I think he did this knowing that it was going to cause him a tremendous amount of trouble in the Republican Party, and it did. And I think, again, Gingrich played a very key role in all of this, because he organized all the Republicans in the Congress. I think virtually all of them, certainly I think almost all in the House, voted against the 1990 tax increase. And he did it for extremely cynical reasons, which was basically he wanted Bush out of the way, because he wanted to be the leader of the Republican Party. And he saw that if Bush was defeated and Clinton was elected, this would elevate him and his stature in terms of his leadership of the party. And unfortunately, it worked really, really well. And by 1994, he was, of course, Speaker of the House, which, if you think of the time from being elected in 1978 to become Speaker of the House in 1994, he was elected at a time when the Republicans had one of the lowest percentages of membership in the House of Representatives. I remember when I was working for Ron Paul, we had 142 or 3 seats, extraordinarily small number. But on the other hand, and this was quite clear to me when I was working for Jack Kemp, having no power to control anything, not having a president of your party in the White House, meant you could do anything you felt like. There was no constraints of any kind whatsoever. And I know that it was enormously difficult for Jack to get co-sponsors. That was essentially my job, was to get co-sponsors for the Kemp-Roth bill. And it was very, very hard, because back in those days, many Republicans still had this very old-fashioned idea that deficits were really, really bad. In fact, they were so bad, it was sometimes worth raising taxes to deal with them. And we forget now that Dwight Eisenhower refused every Republican effort in Congress to cut taxes, kept all the Korean War, World War II tax rates into effect until John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, finally cut them. Richard Nixon ran in 1968 on getting rid of the Vietnam War, the 10% surtax. I'm sure a few people in this room are old enough to have had to pay that. Your tax bill, you calculate your tax bill, whatever it was, and then you pay an extra 10%. That was how that worked. And he had run on getting rid of it, but after he got into office, he decided to keep it because inflation was a big problem. Republican dogma says deficits cause inflation, therefore it's worth your while sometimes to raise taxes, to reduce deficits, to reduce inflation, and so on. And this was a widespread belief even in the late 1970s. But the seminal event that changed all of this was Proposition 13, which in June 1978, or was it 79? 78. Okay. The people of California, as we all remember, voted for this big cut in the property tax that was not in any way offset with higher taxes or with cuts in spending. And it was from this incident, which was just took everybody, was shocked everybody in Washington when it happened, that they would be so quote unquote irresponsible. But the view Republicans came to the view that there's so much waste in government and it's so difficult to cut spending that they began to adopt an idea, a very pernicious idea, I'm afraid, called starve the beast. And this originated to a precise date, which was about 2 weeks after Proposition 13. The Senate Finance Committee held a hearing on the Kemp-Roth bill, and they invited Alan Greenspan to testify. And Greenspan, up until that point, had been very much opposed to Kemp-Roth, precisely because it would increase the deficit and it would increase inflation and so on. And in this testimony, he said, it might be worth cutting taxes to take the money away from the government so that they're forced to cut spending to keep the deficit from rising. And Ronald Reagan later, kind of put it a little more succinctly, as he often did. He said it's like cutting your kid's allowance. You're taking away the credit card from the Congress, and once they no longer have that credit card, they will be forced to become responsible on the spending side. And there was a certain logic, actually, to this argument, because you have to remember, the tax code was not indexed to inflation at that time. We had high inflation, and so the revenues were coming in very, very rapidly. Government taxes, total revenues, increased about 50% faster than the rate of inflation. So if inflation was 10%, you got 15% more revenues without enacting any tax increases. So if you look at any budget from that period, it always showed the budget balanced 2 or 3 years out because of all this additional revenue coming in. And so people, Republicans anyway, felt they were on a treadmill where spending was going up and taxes were going up even faster, and you had to break the chain. And the chain was, we're going to slash taxes, and although they made a lot of noises about cutting spending, they never really tried very hard. And although they did cut some domestic spending, because of course Reagan was raising defense spending at the same time. Now the irony of all this is that it was the defense spending increase was the perfect Keynesian medicine for the problems of the economy at that time. Between the tax cut and the huge increase in government purchases of goods and services through the defense budget, you basically had perfect Keynesian, policy, even as the Reagan administration and every Republican was saying Keynes is wrong, it's evil, he was a communist, and lots of other crazy stuff. They were actually implementing those policies. So fast forward a few years, I was very happy working for a conservative think tank and writing a syndicated column about economic policy, and I wrote a number of columns that supported the George W. Bush's tax policies and got praised by the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee for it. Bill Thomas personally thanked me for my help. And then an incident happened, which I can date precisely to a certain day, which was November 22nd, 2003. Now, some of you may remember, this was the night of the infamous 3-hour vote on the Medicare Part D program, where it's kind of embarrassing when I explain my thinking about all this, but during the summer, as Congress was debating the Medicare Part D program, the Bush White House kept saying, just send us a bill. We don't care what the hell's in it. I'll sign anything. And I thought this position was so manifestly irresponsible that I didn't take it at face value. I thought this was at the height of Karl Rove as a genius, remember? And I thought that this was some kind of Rovian strategy where Karl had figured out that the bill that was going to pass the House was so completely different from the one that was going to pass the Senate that there was no possibility they would reconcile. And so Bush would look good by endorsing a popular policy, but it'll never actually happen, and he wasn't actually going to do anything to help it get enacted. And then I don't really even today know how this all happened. The conferees just suddenly came to an agreement, and they ran that bill to the House and Senate floors so rapidly, and it passed the Senate virtually by acclamation, and then it got to the House, and there were a few principled Republicans who thought, why are we creating a new entitlement program that's going to cost $400 billion over the next 10 years that's not one penny of which is financed? We're just going to put it all on the national debt. And so when the vote came up at I don't know, 2 o'clock in the morning or whenever that was, the bill lost. And so Tom DeLay, who was then the House Majority Whip, they stopped the clock. Normally votes are 15 minutes long. And they stopped the clock, and they literally started arm twisting, all the Republicans. And the arm twisting was so furious that they froze the cameras from the C-SPAN cameras. People don't realize that those cameras are actually controlled by the House leadership, not by C-SPAN. And they had them trained only on the Democratic side of the House chamber, so that nobody could see what was going on the Republican side. And they had the doors locked. People couldn't get out. They went to some congressman, Smith from Michigan, who was retiring and had voted against this legislation. Said, "Look," DeLay said to him, "We'll guarantee that your son will replace you, when you retire if you just vote for this legislation." And later, the House Ethics Committee admonished DeLay for essentially trying to bribe another congressman in such a blatant way. And they had estimates from the actuary of the Medicare system showing that the cost of the program would be much greater than $400 billion. But $400 billion was the number that was in the budget, you see. If it had been 1 penny more, one member of Congress could have derailed the whole thing by calling for a point of order. And Trent Lott later regretted that he did not do so, but a lot of good that did. But anyway, the point is that I didn't think anything was going to happen with this, and I didn't even write any columns about it because I just thought it was just a waste of time. And I woke up that morning and I saw the newspaper stories about how the Republicans had kept the vote open for 3 hours and got a dozen Republican congressmen to switch their votes from against this legislation to being in favor of it to get it enacted, and I was just horrified. Because in those days, I was a very conventional conservative Republican, and I thought Republicans were on earth to cut entitlement programs, not create new ones, and I believed all that nonsensical rhetoric, and so it really was like a cold slap in the face. And shortly thereafter, I realized, well, if we're going to be increasing entitlement spending and not cutting it, we're going to have to raise taxes at some point. And so I realized that they had in fact put in place something that I was very much opposed to at that time, of a tax increase. And I started, and I fingered the Reagan or the Bush administration for being responsible for this irresponsible policy. And I started writing columns criticizing the Bush administration, and this got me into a great deal of trouble with the think tank I was working for because it was based in Dallas, Texas. And most of the members of the board were not only pro-Bush, they're personal friends and neighbors of Bush, and so they were very unhappy with this. The entire board actually came up to Washington and had a meeting with me where they read me the Riot Act and said, if you don't stop writing this anti-Bush stuff, we're going to fire you. So I started easing off in terms of my public statements, but I couldn't not say anything about this, so I decided to write a book. And I spent a good part of 2005 writing this book, and I knew I was going to get fired for writing it, and I even thought about trying to do it under a pseudonym, but I foolishly thought, well, but then I won't be able to market the book. I won't get any speaking engagements. Well, it was ridiculous. So I finished writing this book on Labor Day of 2005, and being foolishly irresponsible, I sent a copy to my boss at the think tank. And he called me 2 weeks later and said I was fired. No severance, no nothing, after being with the organization for 10 years. And I said, why? And he said, your book is costing us contributions. You have to realize the book was not published. Exactly 3 copies were in existence, one that he had, one that I had, and one that my editor had. So he was lying about all of this. Anyway, so I lost my job and became permanently unemployable in the think tank industry, but at least I could write about whatever I felt like in my columns. And when my book came out, I managed to get on both The Daily Show and The Colbert Report, so that was kind of nice. But the interesting thing in terms of what happened subsequently is that once I kind of broke with the Republican tribe, two interesting things happened. One is I lost literally every friend that I had in Washington. People would, after my book came out, people would literally walk across the street when they saw me coming. And, friends of mine who were as close to me, I thought, as, family, stopped talking to me, stopped inviting me to their house and things of that sort. But at the same time, I was kind of liberated by, instead of seeing the glass as half full, I saw it as half empty. And it kind of opened my eyes to a great many things that I had kind of taken for granted and been supportive of, such as tax cuts and cutting entitlements and things like that. And so, over the last 10 years or so, I've just kind of drifted further and further and further to the left to where I'm, virtually, I'm to the left of every person I know on the left, actually. But the interesting thing is that I still consider myself to be a conservative in the sort of classical Burkean mold, and I support things like the welfare state for conservative reasons, for the exact same reason that Otto von Bismarck supported the welfare state. It's good to have a stability in society. It's good not to have starving people in the streets. A billionaire friend of mine who's prominent in liberal politics told me, he said, look, I don't want to have to go around with bodyguards. I don't want to have to send my children to school in bulletproof tank-like cars. I don't want to have to worry about whether my food is poisoned. I want to live a normal life, and I'm willing to pay to make sure we don't have to live like the rich people in Latin America do, surrounded by barbed wire and traveling everywhere with masses of bodyguards and worrying about having your children kidnapped. Anybody who travels to Latin America doesn't buy kidnap insurance is probably rather foolish because the system is very well developed among the insurance companies for paying these people off, and they don't like it if they don't get paid off. But anyway, what I wanted to get to in the last couple minutes here is that when I made my conscious break with the Republican Party back in the mid-2000s, I thought I was on the cutting edge. I just thought I was the first and that there'd be lots and lots of people behind me. And I also thought, rather foolishly, that my imposter book, my attack on George W. Bush, was to the benefit of the party that I still then belonged to. I thought, Bush is such a disaster. He's going to lead us to guaranteed defeat in 2008. What we need to do is kind of lance the boil and get Bush out of our system, and so that we can have new leadership that might have a fighting chance of holding the White House in 2008. But the universal reaction to what I wrote was, "You are a traitor. We want nothing further to do with you." And this from people whose opinion of George Bush wasn't any higher than mine. It's this tribal loyalty thing that I still don't quite understand. I'm trying to come to grips with it because I think it's the central issue that I know that many of the political scientists in this room are trying to understand is, what is the glue that binds people together to support Trump, for Christ's sake? I mean, here's a guy who doesn't deserve more than 10 or 15% of the vote. I mean, that's the really rock-hard, crazy, stupid, idiotic, racist, bigoted portion of the population that we're unfortunately never going to get rid of. But why is he at 40%? I mean, this has to include, normal, sensible people. And my wife Nancy and I, talk about this all the time because we have a few friends, such as Roger Stone, for example, who we've known for decades, and we just try to understand, what are they thinking, and I still don't quite understand it. But I have been gratified to see, just recently, a few people, George Will, for example, publicly announced that he was renouncing his membership in the Republican Party, changed his registration in the state of Maryland. Steve Schmidt came out the other day. He had been, McCain's campaign manager. He said the entire party's brain dead, and he's been trashing the party even more than I do these days. And you're seeing a lot of the sort of the professional consultant class of the Republican Party breaking finally and saying this is just crazy, because I think they now understand we cannot win the White House with the demographics and just the utter insanity of this idea we have to stand for ridiculous principles, all the time and can't make deals, and all this stuff that we've been talking about today is all exactly correct. And I just wanted to finish with a minute about the media, because this is where I think we've got a really, really serious institutional problem in society, where people just don't have the information they need to make a democracy work. You just can't have people who don't know anything and who are just utterly ignorant and believe utterly crazy and stupid things. It's not right that their vote counts the same as ours, I mean, the only reason we can't change the system is because the alternative is worse. But it wasn't that long ago that we all had a fairly common base of knowledge. You had, the three TV networks that were pretty much interchangeable. People got most of their news from newspapers and magazines that were, by and large, competently edited and reported. And then something happened in the mid-'90s, and that I think is very much underestimated in its political importance, and that was the creation of Fox News. Because up until that time, every conservative, every Republican on earth thought that the entire media was hopelessly biased to the left against them. And all of a sudden they had a network that was on 24/7 where they could sit and hear conservative commentary, praise for conservative ideas and conservative politicians, and they just glommed onto that, like a man dying of thirst in the middle of the desert who found this little oasis. And so I use Fox, as a euphemism, but of course since then we've had the internet and talk radio even before that. And so now we have a situation that I call self-brainwashing, where you have people who just live in a bubble, where they watch Fox all day, they listen to Rush Limbaugh, they listen to Sean Hannity, they go online and read Breitbart and WorldNet Daily, and there's no constraint on the insanity and craziness. And I really think it's become like the jokes about the old Weekly News of the World, remember that? Where they just make stuff up, say, about, what was their thing, the Bat Boy or something like that? Anyway. So I think this is the institutional problem that something has to be done about. And my last point is, I've been trying to think of a way to deal with this problem of that the media is just dying for lack of resources, and they put all these children in charge of doing reporting on campaigns, and the only thing they know how to do is he said, she said. They have no real training in journalism, because all the mentors, the older journalists that would have taken them under their wing and explained to them how to do stuff and how to have an accurate bullshit detector, they all got laid off, years and years ago in the first round of buyouts, because those were the people who were paid the most. And so they're all gone, and they're just floundering around, these young people who I feel terribly sorry for. And I've been thinking that real journalism may be a kind of public good that has to be subsidized in some way, shape, or form. And I was thinking that we actually have done this throughout most of our history. Think about it. The radio and TV stations got free spectrum, incredibly valuable spectrum that grows in value every day as we have more and more need for it. And all they were asked to do in return was to do some public service programming. And so the major networks viewed news programming as fulfilling this part of their mandate, and they ran, they had huge news gathering operations, even though they only had a tiny window of news to present. And they never thought, nobody in Walter Cronkite's era thought, oh, we need to make a profit on the evening news, and things of that sort. But that's another of the pernicious effects of Fox, is they showed you can make money, presenting the news, huge amounts of money. I mean, Murdoch makes upwards of $1.5 billion every year just from Fox. Not to mention all of his many other properties. And we also had, since at least the 19th century, heavily subsidized mailing rates for newspapers and magazines. And this is another way the government subsidized the distribution of news and journalism. But now the print media is dying, the post office is dying, the networks now view their news programming as a profit center and impose upon it the same constraints that they do on everything else. We're cutting costs and raising rates and doing everything possible to increase our audience share so that we can charge higher rates for advertising. And so the subsidies that were in the system, my point is, are no longer have any value. We have to create some new type of subsidy. And I'll just throw out my final idea here, which is I think it'll have to be done not by the government but by the private sector. And I think academia is the model to follow. Many people here have endowed chairs. Corporations, rich individuals, foundations create chairs at universities, the Joe Blow chair of this and that and whatever, and they donate money to the university, and the university controls all aspects of this. They decide who to hire and so on. The people who donate the money just get the goodwill of having their name on somebody's chair. I don't see why we can't have, the Ford Foundation Fellow in International Reporting at the New York Times. And so they agree, okay, for 10 years we're going to give you $250,000 a year for you to go out and hire the best, foreign journalist you can find and pay his salary and pay his benefits and have some money left over to cover some expenses and so on. And you can, and it'll be up to the newspaper to decide who will to hire, okay, for this chair, and it'll be entirely up to the newspaper to decide whether to publish anything that the guy writes. So there's a completely arm's length relationship here. But it seems to me that this would allow for the rehiring of substantive, senior level, experienced journalists who are now completely, almost virtually disappeared from the major media, and at the same time create product that hopefully will have some demand. I mean, I'm very skeptical of Heather's view that fact-checking is coming back into popularity. I view fact-checking as a little journalistic ghetto where the journalist can say, well, we didn't have to do any fact-checking in our actual reporting because the fact-checking department over there, that's their job, they take care of that. And nothing that the fact-checkers do ever appears on page one. It never appears in the print editions of papers like the Washington Post. It's just sort of there so that they can say, well, we have our journalistic integrity. There's the fact-checkers. Go read what they have to say. So I'm just going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Will you take questions?
Oh, look.
I think we have a few minutes for questions.
I'm willing to stand here and take questions for as long as people can control their thirst.
Well,
or you can even open the doors and go get a drink and bring it back. I don't care.
We only have about 10 minutes on the cameraman, so do we have questions directed toward Mr. Bartlett?
Nancy, you must have a question.
So I'm a master's journalism student at NYU, so I found the last thing you said particularly interesting. Do you have any plans to try to play a role in facilitating that, or like how do you envision the most likely way of that being facilitated?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's two ways this could be done. One is have an intermediary institution, like, for example, ProPublica, where people, who were inclined to do so would give money to ProPublica to create these chairs. And that way there's arm's length, distance between them and the person giving the money. So, because obviously the great concern is going to be that, Exxon will create the Exxon chair in energy studies, and the person holding that chair will have no credibility. The other would be for some organization, I don't know who, the National Association of Newspaper Editors or some such group like that, would set up a list of criteria that had to be met that I basically outlined, which is the money must be given with no strings attached, and the newspaper or other media organization that accepted these people would have the final say on what they would publish or if they would get published at all. So you would still have total editorial oversight. All you're doing is trying to provide net additional resources for covering some of the non-sexy things that need to be covered that papers are just not going to be able to spend the money to hire people to cover anymore. They just can't do it. And we all know that practically every foreign bureau of every major newspaper has been closed down. And there's lots of issues, subjects, economic policy, demographics, things that require statistical knowledge. And here's another thought. One of the things they have in academia that's great is sabbaticals, every few years. Why can't the idea of a sabbatical be generalized in the public? So think about a guy who's a doctor, an MD, a physician at wherever, Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. Maybe he could be given one of these journalistic chairs to go to the New York Times for a year or more and write about health policy. He's not a trained journalist, but he knows everything there is to know about medicine. He can write from the inside with great expertise, and I think writing is something that's not that hard to teach. So I think you can teach journalistic skills and writing skills to somebody who's an expert more easily than you can take somebody who's a writer but knows nothing about this stuff and has to learn it all from scratch, which is basically the journalistic model. You go around and ask people a lot of questions and you figure stuff out. And you're kind of everyman, that's the journalist model. And you ask the questions that the reader would ask if he were there talking to, a Nobel Prize winning, chemist or something. So I would like to see this kind of idea expanded, and, organizations may even create sabbaticals, because I think fulfillment in work is a growing problem. You're seeing people, quitting apparently high, well-paying jobs in places like law because they just can't stand the work anymore. It's just too boring. But if they had the opportunity every 7 years, isn't that the typical thing for a sabbatical? Every 7 years you can take a year off, and we'll pay. And you can go to work at the Washington Post or Time Magazine or such place and write about the issues you care about under, all the arm's length type criteria. And maybe you could have, a synergy here where you're adding new input, new product, covering important issues by people who are experts in those fields, providing journalistic, enterprise.
Well, I know I'd take it, but I think Paul wants to chime in, and Dave as
Okay.
well.
It's fascinating. The whole thing is fascinating. You touched on something, then you moved on pretty quickly about the mix of motivations among some of the people who you worked with for many years.
Mhm.
And then when you left, you looked back and you thought there'd be people following you, and there
Yeah.
weren't. And could you say a little more about what you think the mix of, how much of this is about belief systems, ideology, and how much of it's about interest? Like I think this is meant, and I always think every cynical quote is thinking, but it's hard to get somebody to believe something if their salary depends upon them not believing.
Yeah. Well, there's no question that the think tank area is the area I know best. And there's no question that they become very kind of perverted over, the years that I've had affiliation with them, and I've worked at the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, and various other places, is they adopted a business mentality where they tended to view their contributions as the measure of their success. So, for example, if you go back before the 70s, you'll look at the boards of various organizations, for example, the Heritage Foundation. They had, professors and, public intellectuals. Midge Decter was a member of the Heritage Board and people of this sort to bring try to maintain a bit of a academic discipline. And they've all been replaced by big businessmen. And I've seen studies on this. One of the first things that happens when you have a board filled with rich people and business people is they view the president of that organization as a peer, you see, who ought to be paid at a rate equivalent to what they pay themselves. And so, and then the businessmen, being the type of people they are, they like to look at money as a measure of success. So they don't look at how many papers you published, how many books you published, how many members of Congress mentioned your work in the Congressional Record and so on as a measure of success. They looked at the number of contributors you had. How much money did you bring in? Therefore, you've been successful. You deserve a percentage of the money you brought in. And so all of a sudden, all of the incentives of the leaders of these organizations is to just maximize revenue. And one of the things they've done over the last few years is they set up 501c4 affiliates. The Heritage Foundation has its C3 affiliate, which is tax exempt, and they have something called Heritage Action, which is essentially a political action committee. And so they're running ads and doing lobbying and doing all these other things that they're legally prohibited from doing as a tax exempt, but at the same time, they're fulfilling the contributors' desires to have a more immediate impact on policy. I'll finish with one anecdote. Years ago, when I was still with the NCPA, I was talking to one of their very, very wealthy contributors, and I was curious about his motivation for giving money. Up until that time, I had assumed that the tax deduction that he got for contributing money to us was something of great value to him, but he basically said, no, what's a deduction for $50,000 when I'm making, hundreds of millions or whatever it was. And so he basically said, look, what I do is I have a budget for public policy, politics, and so my contributions to candidates, my contributions to political action committees, my contributions to think tanks, all comes out of the same pot of money. And I remember being horrified when I heard this, because I figured, we can't compete. How can a think tank promise to do a study about why we need to cut the capital gains tax when they can just give money to some congressman and say, the day I'll introduce a bill, I'll spend every day of my congressional career trying to get the capital gains tax cut. And what if this guy's the chairman of the committee? I mean, how can we compete, you see? And that was the first moment when I realized things were going downhill, and that was in the early 2000s, and it's gotten much, much, much worse since then. And in fact, if you'll bear with me, to get back to your original point, are people out, is it money or ideology? Well, the problem is there's so many billions of dollars now sloshing around, and nobody understands where this money goes. It all goes into the pockets of the consultants, you see. That's why there's this big fight at the beginning of each election cycle about who's going to get which consultant in your pocket. Because this is a signal to the PAC community, oh, this guy's a serious candidate because he's got Mike Murphy working for him. Mike Murphy ran Jeb Bush's PAC. It raised $150 million. He put $15 million of it directly into his pocket. Now, how do they do this? They go to the Congress, to the governor, and say, we need to run ads. Well, the ads are bought by the Mike Murphy, advertising, and he gets a 15% cut of all the money that goes out to buy ads. And it just goes on, direct mail, all these things. And say Jeb is losing, the first thing Murphy's going to say to him is, you got to raise more money. It's the one thing that they know that in their heart of hearts will help. And then they'll say, well, what can I do with this money? Should I set up a grassroots organization? No. Buy more TV commercials. See, so they make vast amounts of money from this racket, and it is a racket. And so for somebody, the only people who are going to break are people who are so senior or they made so much money they just don't care anymore, and they're out of the racket, like Steve Schmidt. Yeah.
So Bruce, though, do you think the total failure of that strategy in this year's election will have any effect whatsoever on this business model?
Well, this is.
You had millions and
Yeah.
millions of dollars were raised with
Yeah.
Jeb Bush and some of the other
Yeah.
establishment candidates, and they completely failed.
This is an extraordinarily interesting question. It's one I've been trying to figure out for myself. See, the problem is that there's other now competing profit sectors. And people like Steve Bannon, who used to run Breitbart, he's now Trump's campaign manager. I think he's thinking about how he can basically get a piece of all this action and how he can set up, the Trump News Network and take some of the money that's going now to Fox News. And I think there's a very definite possibility they'll think about starting a political party. Now, admittedly, there's the hurdles. I forget who talked about that. The hurdles are very huge to set up a party and get ballot access and things like that. But it's really just a question of money. The libertarians have managed to do it, and others have. And I think one of these days somebody's going to realize, wait a second, there's federal matching funds available. All we got to do is get a minimal amount of money in various states from a number of people, and then the federal government will write us a huge check. I mean, there used to be people, I don't see them around anymore, but there used to be a woman named Lenora Fulani who used to run every 4 years just so she could get federal matching funds, and that's basically what she lived on until the next election. It was just and I mean, there's enough money there to be raised almost costlessly. That's the whole point. And to finance enough money to pay Steve Bannon, a couple $100,000 a year for doing absolutely nothing. And so I think there's going to be an enormous competition. And so then the question becomes, how does the establishment part of the Republican Party react? And I think that at some point, there are no moderate Republicans, but there are pragmatic Republicans who say to themselves, look, you're right, we need to abolish Social Security, but that's not a very popular issue. Let's see if we can do something else that will be popular with the voters that will get us elected, because I think after a few cycles of being out of the White House, it becomes a huge demand to get your guy in the White House. I mean, there's all these think tank people and professors like these people here who really, really want to be Assistant Secretary of the Treasury or Assistant Secretary of State, who will glom on to whatever Republican looks like he has a chance of winning so that they can get a nice job after the election, or they want to be the ambassador to the Vatican or something. And so, or you're a business that needs a regulation, and you need not to get rid of a regulation, but you need a regulation to do something. Maybe it's just to screw your competitor, I don't know. So there's a demand that eventually imposes pragmatism. And I think the consultants and the pollsters will be the ones leading this, because they have the data, they have the arguments. They can say, look, I'm with you 100%. We need to, build a wall across the Mexican border, but we haven't got the votes, so we got to do something else.
Well, on that note, why don't we'll have Bruce here all night if we don't take this into the other room. Thank you very much.